Good afternoon, I'm Billy, I'm an alcoholic. And welcome back from lunch. I have myself a couple of notes here. So I have the interesting job of talking about the traditions for an hour. So, with that, I'm going to try to bounce from place to place. I'm sure all the other speakers have realized that the exact spot where you stand behind this podium is like being at a table that you have to put 3 sugars underneath one of the sides, because if you don't stand in the exact spot, you go over. But I would ask, to start off, that before you get mad at me or want to see me in the hospitality room or anything else like that you just keep one thing in the back of your mind, because I'm only going to refer to our literature. And that is, whatever your sobriety date is, where you would be today if AA didn't exist the day that you decided you need help, is the only question I would ask for you to consider. AA started on June 10th, 1935. It is really not that old in the history of the world. You know, in St. Louis, we know that in 2035 we'll celebrate the International Convention and AA's 100th anniversary. I'm sorry, we don't know where in 2035 yet. In 2030, we'll go to St. Louis after going to Canada. But, like, where would I be? Like, what would have happened, really, if AA left and was no longer here before my sobriety date? Like, do I think my life would be the same as it is today if I didn't have AA to go to? And maybe some people have a different answer. Maybe they think their life would be better if they never went to AA. Maybe they think that drinking was just a phase and it kind of would have just been fine. It would have just been basically the same as it is today. But what really would most of our lives be like if AA was still not here when we needed it most? And the paradox in AA, what I think is the greatest paradox that I talked about last night, is that usually when we decide to stop drinking, we need to drink the most. It's a horrible paradox. Life is not going well at all. And we're ready to give up the one best friend that has been there all the time when life is not going well. Alcohol, King Alcohol, John Barleycorn, call it whatever you want to call it. But it's interesting. You know, I look at the steps, the traditions, and the concepts the following way. I think the steps are our message. I'm sorry if that offends anyone. If anyone thinks we have another message, that's just not my experience. We only have one message, the steps. The traditions protect our message. They're kind of like guardrails on a highway. There's really not too many other groups of people that need guardrails on a highway more than us, based on our driving records when we get here. So if you just think about them as guardrails on a highway, and then the concepts, which I believe their job is to perpetuate Alcoholics Anonymous, to make sure that AA service continues and continues, so that when somebody who needs to come to AA knows where to find us. But what you'll never hear about the steps outside your local clubhouse or your home group, even if we say the steps are suggested, have you ever heard someone talk somebody out of a 4th step? You know what? Don't worry about the 4th step. It's really overrated, not necessary. Was nice what Steve had to say about it today, but it's really not needed. And amends, isn't that going a little too far? Aren't we really taking things ourselves a little bit too serious? Maybe we just need to make the list and don't need to make amends. But when I say that, it sounds crazy. Sounds insane. Like, what kind of AA member outside your clubhouse or home group would talk you out of the recipe for salvation for alcoholics that's been available, especially since our book was published in April of 1939. Now, I say that while saying I totally appreciate other ways to get sober and totally respect them. That's what my book tells me to do. My book tells me my hat should go off to them. That if you found another way to get sober, that is awesome. That's just not how I found to get sober. For me, nothing else has worked except Alcoholics Anonymous. So then why today is it popular to hear people say the traditions don't matter? Or those people are just taking it a little bit too serious? Or maybe they're just a little over-the-top dogmatic. Would you hear that if somebody just suggested to someone dying of alcoholism that, like, take me for example. I'm a person who was in and out for 9 years. It's easy for me to think I'm a first-time winner because my sobriety date is when I was 23 years old. So now, 32 years later, I feel like a first-time winner, but that's not the truth. I was in and out for 9 years. And we all know there's a couple of different types of people we meet when they come into AA. There is the person who you meet right off of Skid Row, right off of the street, right in the homeless shelter, who has destroyed their body mentally, physically, emotionally. And I can't tell them to read 2 pages in the big book every day. They could barely comprehend one sentence. They have drank themselves into such bad shape. So I know people come in all different sizes and forms to AA and conditions. But what about me? What about when I meet me? Who's me? The person who's been in and out of AA for years and has done everything except the steps. They've done everything. They've gone to the young people's dances. They've gone to the bingo night at the club. They've gone on speaking commitments. They've done everything except the steps. If you saw someone who was in that condition, which unfortunately sometimes it looks very healthy, it doesn't look like there's basically a doctor standing behind them with 2 paddles in their hands. That's how close to death they are, but they appear physically okay. Would you tell somebody to not tell them to do his 4th step? Would you walk up to someone and say, hey, what the hell are you doing telling them to do a 4th step? You would never say that. But yet in today's day and age, talk about the tradition sometimes becomes a little complicated, or maybe looks like the police. So the things I want to talk about, if you're a student of the Big Book, you can go out to that tapers table and there's a bunch of tapes there of people who are great at talking about the Big Book. There's probably a couple of tapes there of people who are great at talking about the traditions. If you can find Don P. or David A., please listen to them. But Don P. From Aurora, Colorado, he made a prediction a long time ago. If you're familiar with kind of the Big Book revolution in Alcoholics Anonymous, of when it really kind of came alive, it would be the 1980 International Convention in New Orleans, Louisiana. And what is special about that is that for the first time, 2 days before that convention, 2 men who were really only known in a small part of the country did a Big Book workshop. Their names were Joe and Charlie. And that Big Book workshop blew up. People... Now, if you never had the ability to meet Joe and Charlie, I met them many times. They had a unique way of presenting the Big Book. If you're my age group or older and in my age range, you may remember a show on National Public Radio called Car Talk. If you remember Car Talk, it was these 2 old brothers, Click and Clack, who just talked about cars. Like you could call them up and say, I heard this noise. And they would diagnose you over the radio. And they gave people help, regular people help on buying new cars, fixing their cars. Joe and Charlie were as close to click and clack and car talk as you could come when it comes to the big book of Alcoholics Anonymous. They were not preachers. They were not experts. They had a love of the book that developed because originally they met because of their wives at Al-Anon conventions. That's how they met each other. And so they would talk about the big book while Al-Anon was going on. And, you know, as this big book revolution went on, and you hear names like Don P. and Joe H. and Mark H. and a whole bunch of names that you hear. And, you know, Don made a prediction in one of his talks a long time ago. And he said, you know, there's two great things that Don P. said in my humble opinion. The first one was, he was asked one time, what has he really learned from working the steps and being an active member of AA? And it was on a Q&A at a conference, and after like taking a minute to think about it, I guess he was a Led Zeppelin fan, because he said, you know what I've learned? If it keeps on raining, the levee's going to break. I remember hearing that, like, what a simple answer instead of being an expert on the big book. He just threw out that little parable. But the other thing he said was his fear of the big book revolution was that first legacy only AA would become rampant in Alcoholics Anonymous. That people would become so on fire with the solution that they would forget about the things to protect Alcoholics Anonymous, not from the outside, but from the inside. And sometimes that's a big thing that we forget about. The traditions that guard AA from us, not from the rest of the world. If you are a big book thumper of any type, I just want to let you know that even though the traditions weren't published until 1946, you can find them all in the first 164 pages of the big book. They're all there spoken about in one way or another. They just weren't called the traditions yet. I mean, we can admit, Bill W., genius salesperson of the year, right? He called these things traditions and they're new, right? I mean, they came out in 1946 and he called them traditions already, but yet they were brand new. But why did Bill write them? He wrote them because he felt like, you know, if you go to a big book weekend retreat, you hear things like, AA's watered down today. I need the AA the first 100 had. You hear all kinds of statements like that. But truthfully, things weren't going well in 1946 and 1945. Yes, we had found the message. But the greatest thing about Alcoholics Anonymous is our membership. The worst thing about Alcoholics Anonymous is our membership. It's a double-edged sword of the worst kind. What makes us great also drives us crazy. And if you are a student of the 12 and 12, again, I'm one of those lunatics who would have told you the 12 and 12 is watering down the message when I originally found the big book, but I've come to the other side, I hope, a little bit. But in the 8th step, there is a line about relationships and our defective relations with other human beings is the exact wording. And that's what happened to AA by 1946. Defective relations with other human beings had hurt us. If you listen to some old Bill W. tapes, if you get the ones that are redigitalized and remastered, you can hear him tell some funny stories, but one is about like the letters he used to get. A letter from one person who wrote, "Dear Bill, AA's on fire in our town. Our home group is on fire. We have lots of newcomers coming. We're working with the police and the courts and going to the detoxes, and we have it. The only problem we have is this other AA group across the street." We don't even know how anyone's staying sober there. We don't even know what they're doing there. And then Bill would joke around about how weeks later he would get a letter from the other AA group that would say, "Dear Bill, AA's on fire in our city. It's on fire in our group. We're working with the police and the courts. The only problem we have is this other group across the street. We don't know what they're up to over there. We don't know how anyone stays sober there." We have been, I always say to newcomers, please enjoy your time as a newcomer. Please. Do you know what it's like to get a parade when you have 90 days, when the whole rest of your world is burning down? But in AA, we will give you a parade. And then we will judge you for the rest of your life. We will judge every single thing you do. We will talk bad about you, gossip about you, we will do all of it. But this was all alive and well in 1946. It was rampant. And Bill knew that we needed to put some kind of tent around the circus. If you go to aagrapevine.org, you can search the word traditions and you can find the original essays. I'm a big fan of the original essays. I'm a big fan of the original essays because they seem to point out the awesome responsibility on those of us already here to make sure that we preserve AA for those people not here yet. If, again, you're around my age, somewhere within the vicinity, whatever, you might remember that back in the 80s and 90s, there was supposed to be a little-known TV commercial for a budget hotel company that wound up being one of the most famous commercials in the history of advertising because of its one little tagline, "Leave the light on." You might remember that commercial. Leave the light on. That really is the job of the traditions to help AA members with, to leave the light on. Because whether we like it or not, whether we have 1 day or 50 years, all of us in this room are in some way on God's side of safety. Like we got here. Some miracle has occurred. But we're a very small representation of the amount of people dying of alcoholism in the world. And so while we live a day at a time, we have a responsibility to make sure AA is here tomorrow. And we live in a world that is very different, somewhat alike to 1946 and the 1940s, but very different. We live in a world of immediate news, social media, digital communications. That part of the world has changed greatly. You know, I'm going to bring you into a little known, a lot of people don't know this, but I'm going to share it with you. A lot of you probably know that Bill W. died in January of 1971. That's when he passed away. But what you don't know, and maybe some of you have been to Stepping Stones in Katona, New York, Bill and Lois's house. And that was offered to the General Service Board of Alcoholics Anonymous, and they turned it down and said, "We can't own property." And then it was offered to the General Service Board of Al-Anon, and they turned it down. And then a foundation was created that still goes on today, the Stepping Stones Foundation. AA related, but not AA. But you see, another thing happened back then that we don't talk about a lot. You'd really have to know our archives to know that it happened. But a couple of days after Bill W. passed away, a plan that had been hatched before he died was voted on and put into immediate effect by the AA World Services Board. And that was to immediately destroy Bill W.'s office. Immediately. To destroy his desk, to destroy his carpet, to take a couple of walls down, to remove any and all reference that Bill W. had an office at the General Service Office. And that plan was hatched long before Bill died. Bill knew that would happen. But they instituted it a couple of days after he died. And why? Well, I'll tell you why. Our office would still be in that building today if that never happened. We would have built some personal shrine to Bill W. in the General Service Office, and people would still be going to that building today on tours, and everybody would hear, and here is where the co-founder had his office. And this is why we've never moved, even though this building is horrible, it's breaking down, it's not modern, it's costing us a fortune, but we're going to stay here because the shrine is here. And what a brilliant, brilliant decision that was, that we don't talk about a lot. And another thing we don't talk about a lot is that the traditions are to help us with our real alcoholic DNA. Other people, people say, Billy, how does the big book apply to the traditions? Well, I can tell you how it applies. Other people might be able to be famous for being sober. Maybe they can handle it. But the real alcoholic is not wired that way. The real alcoholic is not wired to be famous for being sober. And, as we go through the traditions 1 to 12, which I don't have the time to do today for sure, but the theme of the 12 traditions is personal sacrifice. In fact, if I'll just tell you, if you've never really given the traditions a read, I would tell you, number one, the 12 and 12 is nice. The original essays are better, I think. But the pamphlet, the 12 Traditions Illustrated, is awesome. And in fact, in the 12th tradition of that pamphlet, it has kind of a picture of a building that I guess could be the GSO building. And on the side of it, it says sacrifice. But AA Comes of Age. I'm going to guess there's a few big book enthusiasts in this room. I could be wrong, but my guess is there are. I'm guessing your reaction when you run into someone who says they've been through the steps but never through the big book, it's kind of like mine. Wow, that sounds interesting. I don't know about that approach of going through the steps without going through the big book. But I would tell you that trying to understand and experience the traditions without reading AA Comes of Age is very difficult. AA Comes of Age gets a bad rap because it's not a success story book. It's not a book that chronicles the success of Alcoholics Anonymous. In fact, it's the exact opposite. It chronicles the critical, repeated failures of the early members of Alcoholics Anonymous in like our first 9 or 10 years. If you take the 12 traditions, they basically broke them down into 12 buckets of our 12 biggest mistakes. And I love what it says in the 12 Traditions Illustrated about unity, the first tradition, which is basically almost we only have one tradition, unity. The other 11 are a way to get there and stay there and preserve our unity. That's the whole goal of Traditions 2 to 12, to preserve that great unity that we have. And they're difficult in today's world, I admit it. Anyone here who served on an AA committee of any type, I don't care if it's an anniversary meeting for your group or an area assembly or your local intergroup or everything, the traditions do not make getting things done easier. They don't. They're like speed bumps in the road to prevent someone from like me, who thinks that certain signs are optional. That I think, oh, well, that's the speed limit for everybody else. They just can't see the writing that says 55 miles an hour except for Billy. Billy's a good driver, has a fast car, or no right on red, except for Billy. The 12 traditions were put there to be speed bumps, to make us slow down and think about the decisions we make. But number one, to make sure that the unity of Alcoholics Anonymous is first and foremost. So let me talk about tradition 3 in today's world, because talking about tradition 3 is like taking a Molotov cocktail and throwing it in the middle of the room, right? Because we usually have two camps of people. We have the camp that wants to throw everybody out of AA. That's not helpful. And then we have the camp that thinks AA should be all addictions anonymous. That's not helpful either, and it kills people. So there has to be a much more flexible way to look at tradition 3 while honoring tradition 3. The first is to stop believing some of the urban myths we hear in Alcoholics Anonymous. So what are those urban myths? Well, I'll give you an example from the steps. Like Steve was talking, I loved when he said, the person who comes in late and says, I didn't hear the topic, but I think I love that story because it's so real, right? It took me a long time before I had to follow the example of the men who tried to set an example for me, in that if I come into a meeting late and I'm called on to share, I'm to acknowledge that I arrived late, and as such will share after everyone who is here on time gets a chance to share. I didn't do that right away, but I finally learned the benefit of doing that and setting the example for other people. But what's an urban myth to the steps? You ever been in a meeting on amends? Amends has the best urban myths. Give you a couple of them. Yeah, my therapist told me I need to list myself first on my amends list. I screwed over the rest of the world. I was a flamethrower to everybody else, but I think I deserve that spot as number one on my amends list. You hear that sometimes. Or then we hear people talking about living amends when the big book talks about harms of the past, and living amends seems to be part of the 12-step. But in the traditions, we hear people who love the short form of the third tradition. They love that short form. Can't help themselves. They're just historically not accurate. The long form of the third tradition says our membership ought to include all who suffer from alcoholism, period. Hence we may refuse none who wish to recover, nor AA membership ever depend upon money or conformity. Any 2 or 3 alcoholics gathered together for sobriety may call themselves an AA group, provided that as a group they have no other affiliation. The short form says the only requirement for AA membership is a desire to stop drinking. And then we hear people say, you are a member if you say you are. Well, that's nonsense. The last line of the 12 and 12 narrative says every alcoholic is a member if they say they are. Every alcoholic is a member if they have a desire to stop drinking. But what's most confusing about the third tradition is that it had nothing to do with outside issues. And I wish we would correct our history on this a little bit. Go to a meeting on the third tradition, and within like 2 minutes, you'll have people debating, talking about drugs, not talking about drugs, all kinds of stuff that has nothing to do with the third tradition. The third tradition was about membership. Membership. And what I'm going to say, especially because later on I'm going to talk about things going on in the world, is I am not giving you facts that are political. I am stating facts of the law in the United States of America or certain states between 1935 and 1946. So I don't have an opinion on what I'm going to say. I just want to let you know what the world was like. Number one, it was illegal in multiple states for people of different races to meet publicly in assembly. That was the law. Number two, I mentioned it last night. I have a brother, he happens to be gay. His husband died 2 years ago from this disease, tragically. At that time, my brother couldn't be married, not to another man. Again, I don't care how you feel about the issue. I'm just letting you know how the world was in 1935 to 1946. Sometimes people forget that it wasn't that many years before AA started that women were given the right to vote. It was a very different time in the world. The third tradition was about membership. It was not about what you drank, what you didn't drink, what else you did while you were drinking. It was simply our inclusion statement. The most inclusive principle, probably at least 60 years ahead of its time, maybe 100, that we don't care who you are. We just care, might you have a problem with alcohol? We don't care what religion you are. We don't care what nationality you are. We don't care what color you are. Everybody knows I'm a big Metallica fan, and I always say in relation to the traditions, nothing else matters. Right? If you're a Metallica fan, you know that song, Nothing Else Matters. The third tradition is nothing else matters. We don't care. That I have a sacred responsibility. And in today's world, it gets a little difficult. That if you sit next to me in an AA meeting, or if I meet you in a parking lot, or I shake your hand coming in the door, it doesn't matter if you're gay or straight. And it doesn't matter if you're black or white. It doesn't matter what God you believe in or if you don't believe in God. And actually, believe it or not, it doesn't matter if you're a Boston Red Sox fan. I have to put all of that out of my head. And in today's world, it doesn't matter if you're a Republican or a Democrat. And it doesn't matter if you love guns or hate them. And it doesn't matter if you're pro-choice or pro-life. And I could go on and on. None of it matters. Bill W.'s vision on that was genius. There are two stories that always get taken out of context. I think because they're so similar, they get blended together. The story in the 12 and 12 in the third tradition, sometimes people say that's the transgendered black man with a blonde wig. That's not true. The story in the 12 and 12 about the man who had a stigma much worse. His stigma much worse was simply that he was a gay man in Ohio in 1940-something. That's it. And the call to the founder and the answer of what would the master do. Later on in the 50s at the 23rd Street Clubhouse is the story of the alcoholic who was also a heroin addict who was a black transvestite wearing a blonde wig. The other thing that's important to understand about the third tradition in today's world is we're very unusual as an organization. We don't have any disqualifiers. What's a disqualifier? You ever apply for a job and it says, "Have you ever?" That's a disqualifier. Especially for this room, right? Have you ever? And then it has a yes or no box. And then yes, next to the yes box, it has a parentheses always. And it says, if you checked yes, please attach a narrative statement explaining the circumstances, right? Because at certain things in our world, we have disqualifiers. If you've done something, you might not be eligible. In AA, we don't have disqualifiers. We just care if you're an alcoholic. We don't care what other problem you might have. Now, I've said this many times in many rooms. I mean, is Kingsport, Tennessee going to be the first place I show up and I ask, is there anyone here who doesn't have another problem? Because I'd love to know. Is there anyone here and your only problem is alcoholism? Yeah, I've not met that person yet. I'm dying to, but I've not met that person yet. Because we don't care about anything else. If you're an alcoholic, welcome. And that, I love the AA group pamphlet because it talks about open and closed meetings. Who can come to a closed meeting? It says it very clearly. It's not as Billy sees it. That's the AA group conscience. It says an alcoholic or a person with a desire to stop drinking and a drinking problem. You have to have both. A desire to stop drinking and a drinking problem. Open meetings, anyone can attend, but only alcoholics participate. Non-alcoholics participate as observers. And we talked about my problem with definitions, not Billy's definition of observing, right? You invite me somewhere to observe, I think I get to throw my 2 cents in when you're wrong because that's observing. No, observing just means observing. And let's talk about the world today. I talked about it a little last night. I hate to break it to anybody. I know that our egos sometimes are completely out of control. But there are other people in other fellowships who are spending their Saturday afternoon gathering together because there is on fire about the recovery in their fellowship that we are here. We have to stop talking bad about other fellowships. We have to stop putting down other fellowships. We have to stop acting like we're the mother ship and like we're better than everybody else. Nothing could be more arrogant than that. Nothing. Because there are great other fellowships out there. If you don't believe me, then get online and go to the Heroin Anonymous World Service website. They have their own grapevine. It's called The Main Line. It's online. Read those stories. Read about the tragic, non-alcoholic heroin addicts who were sent to AA, who were dying, and only found recovery when they could find identification. Now, I don't care if you're an alcoholic and anything else. Welcome to AA. Welcome. But I'm not going to stay here and tell you, like that doctor did last year on Zoom, that if you're a sex addict, a gambling addict, an Al-Anon, an AA, have a food issue, or alcoholic, it's all the same. Because that's simply not my experience. And in today's world in AA, how did this happen to me regarding the third tradition? Well, how it happened, I don't know what clubhouse is the closest to where I'm standing, is in my local clubhouse, I started seeing memorial flyers for young kids I knew, and I only knew them from AA. And young kids who I knew never drank. They told me they never drank. And identification is key. The alcoholic or whoever needs to know they're hopeless so that they grab on to the solution. And we'd do a lot better if we didn't just talk about throwing people out versus not throwing people out, and just remembered that the third tradition is about membership. The fourth tradition, quickly, I'm just going to tell you, in today's world, is a very easy rule. If you hear someone invoke the fourth tradition or the word autonomy, one or multiple of the other 11 traditions are about to get run over by a tractor trailer. That's a good rule of thumb if you're in any AA meeting, business meeting. As soon as someone throws out autonomy, I just want to, from a history perspective, we don't have a veto power in AA. The fourth tradition doesn't override any of the other traditions. It has to do with local customs. It has to do with, do you like Earl Grey tea or English breakfast? Does your group like a big sheet cake or cupcakes? Are you a big book meeting or a 12 and 12 or a 3-speaker meeting? That's what the fourth tradition is about. It is not about rewriting the other traditions. And a good way to, how does it work in real life, is whose group conscience is it? Well, if your group isn't the group conscience for the big book, you don't get to change the big book. If your group isn't the group conscience for the steps, you don't get to change the steps. That's someone else's group conscience. You get to change the group conscience that your group conscience covers. And the most difficult thing about it is that when you set a bad example and start breaking the traditions, you're setting an example for the newest people in the room. And they don't know better. And they think it's just normal. They think that's what AA is. The fifth tradition is the one where we talk about alcoholism. The current group conscience in the AA group pamphlet has wording to the effect, I don't have one in front of me, but wording to the effect of, we don't give the suggestion or hint that we know how to recover from anything, including drug addiction. So now we're not talking about drug use, we're talking about drug addiction. It's probably the big difference there. I sponsor a lot of people. They all like to do lots of things when they drink. Lots of things. Most of them illegal. Not all of them drugs. They all seem to have the same thing in common as me, is the later it gets in the night and the more drunk they get, the worse your idea is, the more I like it. That's a big part of my story. The worse your idea is, if I'm on a tear, I love your idea. And the idea you told me at 10 o'clock at night sounds so much better at 2 o'clock in the morning. Like, it's amazing. We're here to recover from alcoholism. Now, I want to tell you my true story. I know plenty of people who have gone through the 12 steps of Alcoholics Anonymous who are alcoholic. And as the big book says, other issues have subsided or gone away. That those spiritual principles have helped. But I also know what it's like to sit down in a diner across from a man who's 8 years sober, who just forged his wife's signature on a second mortgage application that she does not know about because he is many, many thousands of dollars in debt from gambling. And I know what it's like to have to look across at a person like that and say, I can't help you anymore. I'm not an expert on gambling, compulsive gambling, and neither is Alcoholics Anonymous. And your problem is completely out of control. And if you want me to still help you, I will gladly take you to a GA meeting. I will find you a GA sponsor, but I will tell you this. In AA today, it is impossible for me to understand how any active person does not have the numbers in their phone of certain active people in other fellowships. And to stop this competition that somehow we're solution-based and they're not. And it's time for us to stop just, the way we help is we have a meeting directory. It's in the back of the closet under 3 boxes of literature we haven't moved in like 4 months, but we have a meeting directory for that fellowship in the bottom of the closet. No. It's time for us to take responsibility and take people to those meetings and introduce them and not make them feel so alone. Because the bottom line is people are dying. And somewhere along the way, people in AA decided, well, we can help everybody. I ask people this question all the time. Imagine tomorrow that Gamblers Anonymous decided, you know what, we want more people. So effective tomorrow, we're going to start helping alcoholics. Just let the whole world know that if you have a problem with alcoholism, you can come to GA and work the 12 steps. I mean, I don't know about you, but I would find that a little bit offensive. I would be worried about the alcoholics that would die that went there, that weren't also gambling addicts. But why are we so we treat other people's lives with such disrespect that and again, I don't care if you're an alcoholic and a drug addict. I don't care if you're an alcoholic and a sex addict. I don't care if you're an alcoholic and an Al-Anon member. Welcome. Do it. Welcome to AA. But here we talk about AA. But we've had certain erosions over time, and the topic of this is the traditions in today's world, and today's world is difficult. And there's certain things we can do to maybe set the right example for the newcomer. And it's not always easy or popular, but maybe we can do that. I was at a conference, and there was a whole bunch of young kids working in the kitchen. It was a Sunday morning. That kind of room, right? It's like a Lions Club or something. There's a big kitchen in the back of it. I'm on the podium. The chairperson is here, and the chairperson says, I want to thank the people from the so-and-so house for doing the service in the kitchen this morning. Now, on its value, it doesn't sound that bad, right? Not that bad. But what about our newcomers? See, they're not there in the kitchen at that moment as members of that recovery house. They're there as AA members. And I learned this. I moved in 2015, and one of the great things about moving, I'm sure some of the other speakers can relate, is there's nothing like getting your anonymity back at Alcoholics Anonymous. It's the best. When people don't know you, and you can just, because when I was a teenager, I knew who not to talk to. Definitely not talking to that guy. He is one hard-ass SOB, and, he's not like the girl I call at 10 o'clock at night who understands how hard it is to be Billy, right? Because when I call a guy like him, he asks me, what meeting did you go to today? What step are you working? And who did you help, right? I'm not interested in that kind of solution. But I started to meet a lot of guys in recovery houses. And I would ask them, what's your home group? And they would tell me, it's the Thursday night meeting at the house. And I'd be like, what's the Thursday night meeting at the house? And they'd say, people who used to live there come back. I'm like, that's an alumni meeting. That's not a home group. And I'm on the board of a couple of recovery organizations. I'm fully transparent about that. Recovery houses was started with a good purpose. To provide the three basics in life. Food, clothes, and shelter. And to enable people to have those three basics of life so that they could build a foundation in a 12-step program that worked for them. That's what it is. But today, the sixth tradition and affiliation, sometimes newcomers don't know what AA is and what AA is not. The other day I was, see if I can find it. Someone had called me, and, they were a little upset because they were in a meeting and someone shared a really powerful big book message. Which you know what that's like. My fellow big book thumpers can tell me, you know what it's like, when you first get the message of the big book and you go to a really bad meeting and you drop a spiritual nuclear bomb and everybody looks at you like, wow, what does that guy know that I don't know, and who's hiding it from me? We all know what it's like to be like that. But this person came into their meeting and did that and then handed out business cards to everybody. That said, I'm reading it right now, solution-orientated, sober companion, certified recovery coach, certified recovery coach trainer, certified spiritual advisor. I need one of them, actually. Certified motivational speaker. I honor that occupation, but it has no business in Alcoholics Anonymous. It has no business in a meeting or a parking lot. Like, the parking lot, to me, is one of the most spiritual places in the whole world. More miracles sometimes, I think, have occurred in parking lots. And I'm not anti-Zoom, although I'm starting to reject every Zoom invite I get lately. Because sometimes I think we get so overwhelmed and excited about the message of the Big Book, we forget about the power of the human miracle. And sometimes I think we forget about how many people have left an AA meeting and someone across the room just noticed that something looked wrong. The person didn't even say something. They just noticed something looked wrong. And how many lives, if we're all honest about our own lives, have been saved because I was walking to my car in an AA parking lot and somebody just said, "Hey, Billy." That's it. They didn't say, "Rarely have we seen a person fail." They didn't say, "War fever ran high." They just said, "Hey, Billy," and stopped me in my tracks. There are tens of thousands of hundreds of thousands of those miracles in Alcoholics Anonymous that have occurred, because the parking lot is just as much AA as the building and the meeting. But we have to keep these outside issues outside. Now, money, property, and prestige are difficult things for alcoholics. AA is a funny place. I'm kind of a math person myself. We're horrible business people in AA, for sure. We're the only people who think that getting newcomers to give more money will solve our financial problems. I just have some news for everybody here. If your AA group or your AA in a group or your district or your area is struggling, you're not going to find a lot of money with newcomers. Traditionally, they have less than most everybody else. Traditionally, they have no disposable income. Traditionally, they're like me. I first needed to buy a pack of cigarettes and have money for a slice of pizza, and then I could talk about putting money in the basket. But AA has kept itself protected from the outside world by not taking other people's money. We don't even use the word donation. We have an advisory action that says that every place donation is mentioned in AA literature, we should replace it with the word contribution. Because we don't take other people's money. And people sometimes say to me, "Well, Billy, donation, contribution, it's the same thing." So let me explain this, maybe in a way that people can understand. It helped me. In March of 2020, when COVID struck, my accountant called me and said, "We should file an extension for your taxes. We don't know what's going to go on. The government's going to delay it anyway. You have some complications because your life has changed a little bit, whatever." I just filed an extension. In October of 2020, my accountant sent me an email one day. I was at work in a meeting, and it said, "Billy, I need your routing number and your account number. Like, your taxes are due." So I sent them. I have never made a donation to the United States Internal Revenue Service in my life. They are not on my list of charitable organizations. They are not who I want to give my disposable income to that I earmark towards helping people out. I contributed to the United States IRS because I'm a contributing member of society. I pay my mortgage every month. I do not donate to Wells Fargo Bank. I contribute to them because I make a contribution. And, in AA, and I know this is going to sound a little out there, the seventh tradition has been totally destroyed at the home group level. The long form of the seventh tradition says the following: the AA groups themselves ought to be fully self-supported by the voluntary contributions of their, THEIR, own members. We think each group should soon achieve this ideal. Have you ever been in a meeting where someone says, the so-and-so group needs support? I remember one time my meeting, the Westside Young People was going out of business. And I had called a man I trusted a lot. And I told him we had just come up with a good plan. We knew that in New York City we could rent a Circle Line boat at night. And we knew we could charge $20 a ticket and get a really good DJ and get every young lunatic in AA for like 100 miles to drive to New York City on a Saturday night after whatever the Saturday night meeting they went to, and we could pay our bills for like a year. And this man said, Billy, your meeting really needs to go away. And I was horrified. I was like, what do you mean? He's like, your meeting's not self-supporting. And he really got me to understand, because we've become such a meeting-based society. I'll give you a little example. My parents were great people. They really were. Now, was my house dysfunctional? Completely. So completely that me and my siblings have a code word. It was our address where we grew up, 52 West Drive. If we're at some event and we kind of reference 52 West Drive, it means we can't believe what we are either seeing or hearing, usually from an extended member of our family, that this is very reminiscent of 52 West Drive. But my parents did teach us some good things. I don't know who taught them, but they did. One of the things I was taught as a kid is you never go somewhere you're invited without bringing something. I don't know where my mother and father learned that, but they did. My mom would always stop at Entenmann's. If you're not from the Northeast, it's a discount bakery. My mother, she was so Depression-era Irish Catholic to the core, she would go to the Entenmann's thrift store that had expired dates on the boxes, right? But she meant well. And my dad would bring alcohol. Now, if you came to my house today and you brought flowers or a cake or whatever, I would say thank you. But I would not ask you to pay towards the mortgage. And I would not ask you to chip in for the lighting bill. And while you might volunteer to do some dishes, that's on you. Why don't we treat our home groups the same way? I tell people all the time who call me about this, I say, listen, if you put zero in the basket or God knows how much money in the basket, it's none of my business. What I would ask you to inventory is, what basket are you putting it in? Like, keep track of your AA contributions for a month. And at the end of that month, add them up. How much went to your home group and how much went to everywhere else? Because the most important thing is that your home group is self-supporting, that you're taking care of your home group first. Now, do I put a couple of dollars in other groups I go to? Sure. That's my Entenmann's cake. That's I'm a good visitor. But not compared to my home group. My home group I really have to make sure I take care of. And AA just does not take. I know what it's like. I served as a trustee at the General Service Office. I know what it's like to send back large checks. Because we don't take large checks. Even the General Service Office will only take $5,000 a year from any individual. Or $10,000 if you die one time. Not some rolling trust or... Because we don't want anyone to think they're that powerful. And I can use myself as an example. I know Stepping Stones in Dr. Bob's house sometimes publishes a list of who gives money. I've seen my name or my trust on that list. I do that because I've just decided in life, but I make a donation to them, not a contribution. But in AA, we don't want anyone given money like that because everyone is equal. There are no big shots. You know what one of the most spiritual things I ever saw when I wasn't a trustee yet, but I was a director? I was in the general service office, and the CFO at the time asked me to come see something, and I went over to see it, and it was an index card, paper clipped to an envelope. And it had 3 quarters on it and a piece of Scotch tape across the 3 quarters. Like someone had sent 75 cents into the general service office. And what separates AA from everybody else is we are as thankful to you as we are to the person who sends in 5,000. That for us, it's about the spiritual act of contribution. In fact, it cost us more to open it, file it, send a thank you note than the 75 cents. But that's how important the principle is to us. Now, the last thing I want to mention as I finish up here is when people ask me what is going to any lengths meant, because that's what I was taught when I first became a big book thumper. And hopefully now I've, not as arrogant and rigid for sure. But I was asked that when you sit down with a new person, the question you ask them is, are they willing to go to any lengths for victory over alcohol? Much like the line in the 8th step of the big book says. Are you willing to go to any lengths for victory over alcohol? But I've had to redefine my definition of any lengths. Like, I won't take you through the big book if you won't go through the traditions. I don't care about the concepts. They're important. I love them. But I'm not going to send some person with First Legacy recovery only out there with any guardrails without knowing what AA is and what AA is not. Especially in relation to anonymity in the 11th and 12th tradition today, which is the last thing I want to talk about in AA in the world today. Obviously, we live in a very social world, digital world, all kinds of world, but our second part of our name is still anonymous. It's half of our name. And we forget about the newcomer. The newcomer has a right to believe that it's anonymous. You might hold up a camera in an AA meeting and think, oh, it's no big deal, but what about the person with one day who it is a big deal to? What about the person who just left their employee assistance counselor, and when they pulled into the church down the street where the noontime meeting is, they saw their boss's car and were like, oh no, I'll go to another meeting. Like, we forget that this is all about the newcomer. We don't take pictures inside AA meetings between preamble and prayer. We just don't. And 11th tradition is not our anonymity tradition. I hate to break that to anyone. It's our public relations policy. It's how we operate with the outside world. Our anonymity tradition is really tradition 12. And it's a give and take. If you've read AA Comes of Age, there's a very strong line in there. It's shocking to me, Bill's ability at vision, because it says, no principle is more important to the future of Alcoholics Anonymous than this one. Because that one is about being right-sized. That one, and sometimes it's difficult, so I'll give you an example of what's difficult. I don't know what's out there on that taper's table. I have not looked yet. It is possible there could be a Billy N talking about the traditions. Possible. I will not sign it. Ever. Period. Like, we don't autograph things in Alcoholics Anonymous. And we put people in a bad spot when you even ask me, because then sometimes I do it because I feel like if I don't do it, I'm a jerk. So I do it. But what about the responsibility on the people that shouldn't even ask me to begin with? What about only having one level of AA member and letting everyone just be a member? That's it. Just member. And my anonymity, even though I don't disclose it at the level of press, radio, film, in other places, it's for me to talk about and decide. It's my business. If you're new, I'll give you this one small piece of advice. There's a big difference between telling people you don't drink and you're in AA. And if you don't know that, make sure you have that conversation with your sponsor. Because we can hear, oh, the outside world accepts us now or whatever else. It doesn't matter. Just know the difference between letting people know you don't drink and letting people know. There's a great line, it's what I'm going to close with, because it means so much to me. And it was written by a non-alcoholic in 1953. And it's amazing to me that he wrote this. Let us talk about the concept of anonymity. I can remember when the reason for the name Alcoholics Anonymous was based on the fear of human beings having to admit to the world that they had once been afflicted with alcoholism. Yet, within a relatively short space of time, the word anonymity as a device to hide one's past as an alcoholic has disappeared. I know of no alcoholics in AA today who are not proud of their affiliation with the Society of Alcoholics Anonymous. The concept of anonymity today means to all of us the humility that comes with the willingness to serve without hope of gain or recognition of reward. If only all of humanity could function like that. And that's really what the 12th tradition is about. Sacrifice. No rewards, no posters, no certificates, no games, maybe a chip in Florida. If you had a meeting, they give out chips at every meeting. But it's about sacrifice. And it's about, if I work in any business, including my own, if I work in the recovery business, if I work in the firefighting business, if I work in any business, that in AA, I'm just an AA member. I leave that outside the door. I leave that completely. And in today's world, the 10th tradition is so difficult. So difficult. I'm going to tell on my own home group. The day after one of the presidential primary debates in the last election at my home group, so I'm pleading guilty, the first person to share, with 30 years, by the way, not the person with 7 days, the person with 30 years, goes on a rant that he can't believe he didn't hear one of those people talk about God the night before, and then it only got worse from there. And I want to tell you that thank God a couple of members spoke up that we don't talk about that here. That the great thing about AA is that we're completely neutral. Complete neutrality. Is that a man came up to me and a couple of other people in the back of that room and said, I really want to thank you for saying what you said, because I was going to leave this meeting. I didn't feel comfortable. I didn't think I was welcome. I thought maybe because I was different than that other guy who said that I wasn't welcome here. And that goes back to the 3rd tradition. Every alcoholic is welcome here. Period. End of sentence. And our duty is to make sure that that message comes over loud and clear to every person who comes in the door, and that they get their uncomfortable seat and their bad cup of coffee, and that they're given the proper time to decide whether they think they're an alcoholic or not, and if they need help and need a sponsor and a big book and a home group. but I'm not to do anything ever to send the message that maybe you don't belong here. That's all I have. Thank you very much.